A black soldier, a white-collar journalist, 12 million viewers across Africa. One live confrontation that exposed not just political hypocrisy, but the pain of an entire generation. It began with a smirk. Alan Dira, the sharpest voice on national TV, thought this would be easy. Corner the young president, provoke him, break him. But what he didn't know was that the man in uniform, Ibrahim Traore, didn't come to win a debate. He came carrying the weight of villages burned, names of soldiers buried, and children who've never known peace. In just 17 minutes, the audience went from applause to absolute silence. And across the continent, something shifted. Not in politics, but in people's hearts. Because sometimes leadership isn't about shouting louder. It's about standing still while the world tries to tear you apart. This story is a dramatization inspired by real events, emotions, and voices across Africa. Names, moments, and dialogues have been crafted to capture truth. Not as it happened, but as it felt. Because even when fiction speaks, it can still echo something painfully real. Now let's go back to the moment the cameras turned on and a nation held its breath. The red light blinked on. A low hum rolled through the control room as the cameras came to life. A sea of cables curled across the cold studio floor like snakes waiting to strike. The air inside the national TV station was crisp, but the tension was boiling, thick enough to slice with a knife. At center stage, two chairs faced each other beneath an arc of searing studio lights. One was empty. The other held a man already known across the country. Alan Dira, the nation's most feared journalist. He adjusted his cuffs like a man preparing for a surgical procedure. A razor-sharp part in his hair, silver watch flashing under the lights, and a voice that had taken down ministers, generals, even a royal once. His reputation wasn't built on kindness. He was the wolf in the spotlight, the man whose questions didn't just sting, they exposed. And tonight, he had been promised blood. 2 minutes, a producer whispered through his earpiece. Alan nodded, eyes scanning the script. But he wouldn't need it. He never did. He had prepared something sharper than any written word. Assumptions, rehearsed traps, and a smile that cut deeper than silence. Then footsteps. They echoed not loudly but purposefully. From stage left, a lone figure stepped into view. No bodyguards, no entourage, just boots, a worn military uniform, and eyes that had clearly seen more than they ever spoke. Ibrahim Traore, transitional president of Burkina Faso. He walked like a man used to uneven terrain, like someone who'd walked alone under mortar fire. His shoulders weren't stiff with pride, but heavy with something else. Memory, maybe. Responsibility. As he took the empty chair, a hush fell over the crew. Alan looked up and gave a brief smile. One that said, "Welcome. This won't take long." The silence before the first shot was always the most dangerous. A camera zoomed in, close enough to see the faint scar above Traore's right eyebrow. The lighting caught a sheen of dust on his boots. No one had polished them for the cameras. A cue card flashed. Live in 5, 4, 3. The theme music played. The country tuned in. "Good evening, Burkina Faso," Alan said smoothly, turning to the camera like a performer on opening night. "Tonight, we sit with a man at the center of controversy. A soldier who rose to power not through elections, not through legacy, but through circumstances." Then he turned to Traore. His tone was respectful, technically, but there was a glint behind the words. "Mr. President," he began, folding one leg over the other, "what qualifies a man with no political background, no experience, no dynasty, to lead a country this fractured?" There it was, the first strike, delivered like a handshake but meant to draw blood. A beat of silence. From behind the cameras, even the sound technician paused his breath. Alan knew what he was doing, setting the tone, drawing first blood with velvet gloves. But what he didn't expect was the stillness in Traore's response. The president didn't blink, didn't shift. He simply looked at Alan, not through him, not above him, but into him, and waited. It was as if the question didn't surprise him, as if he had heard it 100 times in different forms, whispered by skeptics, shouted by critics, or thought in silence by people too polite to say it out loud. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he leaned back slightly, just enough to seem composed but not defensive. He looked down for a moment, not in submission, but in thought. Then he looked up again. "Is leadership earned in classrooms or in graveyards?" he said softly. "Is a man qualified only when he wears a suit or when he carries the names of the dead in his pocket?" The room froze. No one, not Alan, not the crew, not the millions watching, had expected that answer. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. From a dusty living room in Bobo Dioulasso, a 10-year-old boy named Karim stopped chewing the bread in his hand. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the man in uniform. He didn't understand politics, but something about that voice felt different, felt like home. Back in the studio, Alan smiled, tightly. This wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. He glanced at his next question. The real one, the one meant to sting, but somewhere in the back of his mind, a strange sensation began to creep in. Doubt. Alan leaned forward ever so slightly, like a predator narrowing the gap before the pounce. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the armrest, a gesture that looked casual, but wasn't. The studio lights cast a cold gleam across the gloss of his watch as he lifted his chin, smile still painted perfectly on his face. "Let me rephrase," he said smoothly. "Some say you're just playing soldier in a real man's game. What do you say to that?" It wasn't a question. It was a provocation wrapped in velvet. Someone behind the camera gasped, barely audible. Another assistant shifted nervously, almost knocking over a clipboard. Even Lucy, the lead producer up in the control booth, stiffened. That line hadn't been in the prep notes. That one cut too close. But Traore? He didn't flinch. His expression didn't shift. No muscle in his face twitched. He just blinked once, slowly, like someone watching a storm from the safety of solid ground. Then he smiled. Not broadly, not with bravado, but the kind of smile that comes from knowing something the other person doesn't. A pause, a silence that stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Then came the answer. Measured, calm, deadly in its quietness. "Do you ask those who bleed for their people to prove their worth?" he said, eyes locked on Alan's. "Or do you stand with them and ask what you can give?" Alan's smile faltered. Not enough for the camera to catch, but enough for the man sitting across from him to see. Traore didn't press. He didn't need to. The stillness in his posture was louder than any retort. Up north, in a crumbling two-room house on the outskirts of Bobo Dioulasso, a boy sat cross-legged on a cracked tile floor. His name was Karim, 10 years old. He wore a shirt 3 sizes too big, its collar frayed from years of hand-me-down wear. The television in the corner flickered with a grainy picture, half obscured by static, but the boy didn't blink. He was watching the man in uniform. Not because he understood the politics or the broadcast, but because that man's voice had something different in it, something that made Karim's chest feel warmer. He had never heard a president speak like that before. His grandmother, coughing softly on a straw mat beside him, whispered something, but he didn't hear. His eyes stayed glued to the screen. Something about the man made him feel like he wasn't alone, like someone who had also slept on hard floors, like someone who knew what it meant to go to school without shoes. Back in the studio, Alan cleared his throat. He adjusted his posture, a subtle recalibration. That answer had landed harder than he expected, but he wasn't finished. "Your words are poetic, Mr. President," he said with a slight shrug. "But aren't they just that? Words? Many before you have made promises. Many before you have spoken of sacrifice. Yet here we are, still bleeding." His tone was sharper now, just a notch. Still controlled, still polished, but the edge was visible. Traore took a breath. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked beyond Alan for a moment, toward the crew, toward the empty spaces behind the lens, as if seeing something else. Then softly, "Sometimes we speak not to promise," he said, "but to remember. Words aren't always solutions. Sometimes they're the only way we keep the pain from becoming permanent." Alan opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, because in that moment, something shifted in the room. It wasn't the air. It wasn't the lighting. It was something deeper, as if every person present suddenly realized they weren't just watching an interview. They were witnessing something else, something they couldn't quite name yet. Karim, still watching, whispered to no one in particular, "He's not like the others." And he didn't know exactly what he meant by that, only that his small hands had curled into quiet fists. Only that, for the first time in a long time, he wanted to believe. "Do you ask those who bleed for their people to prove their worth?" Traore said, his voice steady but soft. "Or do you stand with them and ask what you can give?" The words hung in the air like smoke after a shot fired in a silent forest. No music, no applause. No one dared even breathe too loudly. Up in the control booth, Lucy, the executive producer, paused with her finger hovering over the scene switch button. She looked at the monitor, then at the faces of the other producers. No one spoke. No one even moved. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but full, heavy. The kind that fills a room not because there's nothing left to say, but because everything has just been said. On stage, Alan Diarra stared at his guest with a look that was no longer the smirk of a predator. There was no witty follow-up on his tongue, no ready rebuttal. Instead, for the briefest of moments, there was something in his eyes that resembled confusion, or maybe discomfort. Perhaps it was the sudden, unfamiliar weight of being outmatched, not by strategy, but by sincerity. He had expected resistance. He had prepared for spin. He had practiced how to interrupt, how to redirect, how to press harder. But he hadn't prepared for that answer. Not one so quiet, not one so complete, not one that pierced deeper than any argument could reach. Behind the cameras, an assistant lowered her clipboard to her side. Another turned off her mic, suddenly aware of how loud even her breathing sounded. The floor director, a former military officer himself, stood a little straighter without realizing it. And above all that silence, above the lights, the tension, the sweat, was the sound of something shifting. The audience watching from homes, tea shops, buses, villages, they weren't leaning back anymore. They weren't scrolling or texting or waiting for a viral moment to share. They were still, attentive, like someone who had just heard a familiar pain spoken aloud for the very first time. In the modest living room in Bobo-Dioulasso, Karim's eyes hadn't moved from the screen. His grandmother stirred beside him, coughing once, then resting her head again. But the boy's hands were still clenched, not in anger, in something more complex, like his small heart didn't know what to do with the sudden feeling building in his chest. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood the silence, and he felt that sentence. Because Karim had bled. Maybe not on a battlefield, but in the classroom where he was sent home for unpaid fees. In the streets where his friends disappeared into gang fights. In the endless waiting for his grandmother's medicine to arrive from a clinic that never had enough. So when that man in uniform said, "Those who bleed for their people," Karim heard himself. Back in the studio, Alan finally blinked. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough. Enough for viewers to sense that something in him had faltered, that the balance had tilted. This was no longer his show. He was no longer the one in control. He adjusted his papers, cleared his throat, and forced a laugh, but it came out dry. The charm that once dazzled now felt out of place, like an actor who'd forgotten what play he was in. "You speak well, Mr. President," he said, voice thinner than before. "But surely you don't expect people to believe that words alone can fix broken lives?" Traore didn't answer right away. He leaned forward slightly, hands clasped gently, like a teacher at the edge of a desk. His tone didn't rise. His body didn't tense. But his eyes, they glinted. "I don't speak to fix," he said. "I speak so people remember they're not alone." And just like that, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't stunned. It was sacred. The television flickered again. It wasn't new. Nothing in this house was. But tonight, the static felt more stubborn than usual. Karim reached up and tapped the side of the old box with the flat of his palm, the way he'd seen his uncle do when it acted up. The image wavered, blurred into greenish snow. then settled again, clear enough to see the studio lights, the two chairs, and the man in the uniform. Karim didn't know his name. He only knew that his grandmother had told him to sit down and be quiet, and that something important was happening. But he had stopped listening to her 5 minutes ago. Not because he was being disobedient, but because his attention had been completely taken over by the screen. Something about the man in the uniform had captured him. Not the medals, not the way he looked strong. It was the way he spoke. The living room smelled of dust and eucalyptus. The floor was hard, baked earth beneath a threadbare mat, and the wind outside hissed through the holes in the wooden window. His grandmother, wrapped in two old shawls, coughed quietly behind him. A cough that never really stopped, just paused sometimes, as if to rest between rounds. Karim shifted slightly, trying not to disturb her. He was 10 years old with sharp eyes and thinner arms than he should have had. His shirt, once green, had faded into a pale gray blue. A tiny plastic whistle hung around his neck on a frayed string. Not a toy, not anymore. Just a piece of something he once found in the gutter and decided to keep. He didn't understand politics. He didn't know what a transitional president was, or what a coup really meant, or why this man on TV wasn't wearing a suit like the others usually did. But he noticed that this man didn't blink as much, that his voice didn't go up and down like the ones who made promises and never came back. This man spoke slowly, carefully, like he was choosing each word from a place deep inside. And somehow Karim understood that, even if he didn't understand the words. Because it wasn't the words that mattered. It was the weight behind them. It was the way the man said things like, "I carry the names of the dead," and didn't look away from the camera. The way he paused after a question, not to think of how to spin an answer, but to feel it. It reminded Karim of something he couldn't quite name, or maybe someone, his father. He didn't remember his father well, just pieces, the weight of a hand on his shoulder, the smell of charcoal and sweat, the way he used to tell Karim's stories at night, his voice low, almost whispering, like they were secrets meant only for the two of them. His father had left for the north 2 years ago, promising to come back with work, maybe even shoes for Karim, but he never did. His mother had died long before that. Since then, it had just been Karim and his grandmother waiting. So when the man in the uniform said, "Sometimes we speak so people remember they're not alone," Karim felt something swell inside his chest. He sat up straighter. He didn't know why. He just did. The image on the screen flickered again, just for a second, and he instinctively reached forward to fix it. The screen snapped back to clarity, right as the president leaned slightly toward the journalist, eyes focused, calm, unwavering. Karim leaned in too. From outside, a dog barked in the distance. A motorbike passed by, kicking up a gust of red dust that seeped through the cracks in the door. But inside, time had paused. All of it. There was only the screen, the man, the voice, and the feeling that somehow he wasn't watching a stranger. Somehow this wasn't just a man on TV. This was a man who knew how it felt to go to bed hungry, to wear torn shoes, to carry pain like a backpack too heavy for your age. A man who might have once sat on a floor like this, listening to someone else speak truth in a world that tried to silence it. Karim blinked, and in his lap, his fingers curled into tiny fists. Not out of anger, out of something harder to explain. Hope. Fatima's knuckles were raw. The last roll of gauze had run out 3 patients ago, so she tore an old bedsheet into strips and pressed them against the boy's leg, counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3. Hold. Bullets had ripped through the clinic walls that morning, spraying plaster like sleet. The air still smelled of gunpowder, iodine, and fear. Outside, the sun dropped behind a line of charred acacias, turning the sky the color of old blood. She tied the sheet tight, whispered, "You're safe now," and sent the boy stumbling toward a corner where 12 other children huddled behind an overturned metal cabinet. They watched her as if she alone could hold the roof in place. She was 27, too young to carry this much death. But here, age was measured by what you'd survived, not the years you'd lived. A distant pop-pop of gunfire. Then silence. Then a low, thundering nothing that made every rib in her chest vibrate. In Fadan Gurma, silence never meant peace. It meant the fighters were reloading. Fatima exhaled slowly. Her hands shook, not from fear. She'd moved past fear months ago, but from exhaustion that felt permanent, like a second spine. She wiped a smear of blood on her sleeve, glanced at the cracked clock above the doorway, and remembered what day it was. The president would be on air any minute. She almost laughed. President. Until recently, the word had meant suits in the Capitol, speeches on polished stages. But this one, this Ibrahim Traore, wore a uniform like hers, dusty and torn. The rumors said he visited forward posts alone, ate from the same pot as the soldiers, carried a notebook of fallen names in his pocket. Rumors, she reminded herself, meant nothing out here. Still, a tiny spark inside her wanted to believe. She crossed the ward, boots splashing through a puddle that was equal parts saline and rainwater leaking through the bullet holes in the roof. A battered radio the size of her fist sat on a metal tray. She clicked it on, twisting the dial until a voice cut through the static. First the newsroom jingle, then the unmistakable baritone of Alan Diarra introducing his guest. A mortar thumped somewhere beyond the village. None of the children screamed. They'd learned not to. Fatima turned up the volume. Traore's voice emerged, low and measured, like someone telling a bedtime story beside a campfire that could go out any second. She caught fragments between the crackle. Carry the names of the dead. Stand with those who bleed. Ask what you can give. Her chest tightened. She had bandaged wounds without anesthetic, cradled newborns while their mothers died on dirt floors, and once shielded 2 toddlers beneath her own body when fighters stormed the courtyard. No president had ever spoken to that pain until this voice echoed over a radio held together by tape. She could hear Alan's sharp questions, knives wrapped in silk, but every answer came back steady, like a river meeting stone and simply flowing around it. She pictured the studio lights, the polished shoes, the audience waiting for a slip, and she pictured Traore, dust still on his boots, eyes that had memorized too many trenches, sitting unguarded before a man famous for breaking egos. One of the children tugged her sleeve. "Nurse, are we safe now?" The girl's voice was as thin as the IV line running into her arm. Fatima crouched, brushed dirt and ash from the girl's cheek. "We will be," she said, though she had no proof. Yet as she spoke, the radio crackled again. "I speak so people remember they're not alone?" The timing felt like an answer. Fatima stood, straightened her shoulders, and looked around the ruined ward. Broken windows, shattered tiles, children wrapped in makeshift bandages, and still, somewhere beyond the horizon, a man in the Capitol spoke words that fit this room better than any prayer she'd heard. She turned the volume higher. The children listened, heads cocked, eyes wide. For 60 precious seconds, gunfire stayed distant, the roof held, and the war outside paused. Just long enough for a nurse with blood on her hands to believe that perhaps leadership could travel through static and reach even the forgotten front line. Fatima stood in the shadows behind the black velvet curtain, clutching a half-empty water bottle like it was a weapon. His badge read intern, but the lanyard had frayed and the plastic was cracked. No one noticed him. That was the point. He wasn't meant to be seen, just to refill glasses, wipe down tables, and vanish before the real work started. But tonight, he hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He was supposed to be near the guest table, checking whether President Traore needed more water, maybe resetting the glass. But from the moment the cameras rolled and Alan Diarra had spoken that first sharp-edged sentence, Fatima had frozen. Something in the way Traore had looked up, quiet, unreadable, had gripped him. He had come into this job angry, not ambitious, angry. He'd applied for the internship at the station not to learn, but to escape. He needed to be anywhere but the northern village where his father's name was etched on a cracked wall beside 47 others. Soldiers who had been ambushed, outgunned, and abandoned in a place that was supposed to be protected. Adama had been 17 when the news came. He hadn't cried at the funeral. He hadn't spoken at the grave. He'd simply clenched his jaw, lowered his eyes, and decided that men in uniform were nothing more than pawns in games they'd never understand. That war was a racket, that leaders wore camouflage to hide cowardice, not courage. So when he heard Traore was coming to the studio, he scoffed. Just another name, just another face on a poster next to a promise. But what he saw on stage, it was different. Traore didn't deflect, didn't posture. When Alan asked if he felt guilty about mothers bearing sons, he didn't deny it. He said, every single night, and his voice had cracked. That crack hit Adama harder than he wanted to admit. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't for show. It was the voice of someone who had read too many letters from widows and shaken too many hands at funerals. Adama recognized that voice because, whether he liked it or not, it sounded like his father's. He closed his eyes for a second, and there it was again, a memory he hadn't meant to find. His father crouched beside him on the dirt floor of their old home, lacing up boots as the sun rose. His mother whispering, "Come back this time, please." The way his father had kissed her forehead, not with romance but with quiet fear. Adama hadn't wanted to remember that morning. He had buried it, like so much else. But now listening to Traore speak not about victory or pride, but pain. Something cracked in him too. He stepped further into the shadows, hand trembling slightly. The water bottle was still in his grip, but he had forgotten it. Forgotten the studio. Forgotten Alan's smug face. Forgotten his job. All he saw was a man on stage who wasn't hiding behind his uniform, but carrying it like a weight. Not to command attention, but to hold something broken together. And for the first time since his father's funeral, Adama whispered something he hadn't dared in years. "Papa," would have followed him. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even forgiveness. But it was a beginning. Alan shifted in his chair, the subtle movements betraying a growing tension beneath the polished exterior. He had played this game 100 times. Build the guest up with a few well-mannered jabs, then go in for the cut when the guard was down. But Traore wasn't lowering his guard. If anything, he seemed to grow steadier with each exchange, as if drawing strength from the very pressure meant to break him. Alan glanced at his notes, not because he needed them, but because looking away gave him a second to breathe. His usual weapons, sarcasm, charm, cynicism, were dull tonight. The crowd wasn't laughing. The studio wasn't on his side. And worst of all, that man in uniform wasn't playing the part of the cornered leader. So Alan raised the stakes. He leaned forward, voice cutting like a wire pulled tight. "Mr. President," he said, "you speak of sacrifice, of pain, of service. But let's talk about results. Let's talk about the villages still under siege, the children still starving, the promises unkept." The lights above the studio buzzed faintly, the air suddenly too still. Alan didn't stop. "You came into power as a symbol of change, a soldier of the people. But the facts are plain. Conflict continues. Families still flee their homes, and trust is fading. So if you speak so often of sacrifice," he let the words hang like smoke, "will you admit your failures?" The silence that followed was not the dramatic pause Alan hoped for. It was heavier, realer, not suspense, but reckoning. Traore did not answer immediately. He looked down, then slowly unclasped his hands, resting them lightly on his knees. He nodded once, as if the question had been expected all along. And when he looked up, his eyes weren't defensive. They were tired. Not the tiredness of fatigue, but of someone who had spent too many nights remembering names, too many mornings writing condolences. "I will," he said. His voice was quiet. "I will admit what others won't, that we haven't done enough, that we haven't saved every village, that we haven't fed every mouth, that mothers are still bearing sons, and I carry that, not as shame." He paused, "but as fuel." Alan blinked. Traore continued, more slowly now. "I didn't come here to prove perfection. I came to serve, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Because it should hurt. If it doesn't, you're not leading. You're pretending." There was no applause, no gasp, just breath held in throats too unsure to exhale. In the control booth, Lucy stared at the screen, her hand frozen over the volume control. The staff around her were no longer working. They were watching. Back on stage, Alan felt the shift again. He had asked for a confession and gotten something worse. Honesty. Not the kind that dances around guilt, but the kind that embraces it, that owns it without fear. Still, he couldn't back down. Not yet. He straightened his spine. "And what do you say?" he asked, slower now. To those who believed in you and now feel betrayed? Traore's face didn't harden, but his expression changed. Not into anger, but into something deeper, almost like sorrow. I say this, he replied, that if hope dies in them, then I have failed. But if it still flickers, even weakly, then I still have work to do. I don't ask them to follow me. I ask them to hold me accountable. Every day. Alan sat back slightly. He had expected resistance. He got responsibility, and that was harder to argue with. In a small village cafe, a group of men crowded around a radio, their teacups forgotten on the table. One of them, a veteran with a scar down his jaw, exhaled sharply. "He doesn't lie to make us feel better," the man muttered. "He tells the truth, to carry it with us." And across the nation, screens stayed lit, conversations paused mid-sentence, and people leaned just a little closer. Because the man who was supposed to be defending himself was doing something else entirely. He was owning every failure, and somehow that made them trust him more. Traore didn't respond right away. After owning his failures with a clarity that felt more like confession than defense, he simply sat there, quiet, composed. But his hands, for the first time since the interview began, moved slowly toward the inside of his jacket. He reached into the breast pocket and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper, its edges softened, corners bent. Alan watched, uncertain. This wasn't part of any prep, not in the show rundown, not on the teleprompter. There was something unfamiliar about the motion, unscripted, unguarded, a kind of stillness that pulled the room inward. Traore looked down at the paper for a second, then up toward the camera. "There's something I've been carrying," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "Permission to share it." Alan gave a small nod. It was the first time he'd said nothing. Traore unfolded the letter gently, like it might tear if handled too quickly. The lights above seemed to dim in that moment, though no one touched the controls. The air tightened. "My name is Captain Sidibe." His voice had changed, slower now, each word deliberate. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home." Someone in the control room gasped. Even Lucy, hard-shelled and seasoned, covered her mouth with one hand. On the studio floor, one of the interns paused mid-step, holding a tray of water glasses that suddenly felt too loud to move. "I ask, Mr. President, that you read this for my son. Tell him I didn't fight for medals. I didn't fight for rank. I fought so he could one day kick a ball in an open field without hearing gunshots, so he could laugh without flinching, so he could go to school with both shoes and come home to both parents." The room stilled. Even Alan, whose reputation was built on the ability to remain unshaken, found himself inhaling slowly, trying to keep his face neutral, but his jaw clenched tighter than before. His pen, held poised in his hand for most of the show, now hung useless at his side. Traore lowered the letter. "Captain Sidibe died yesterday," he said, "in Jibo. He left behind a wife and a 3-year-old boy. His wife is watching tonight." No one moved. The camera zoomed slightly, unprompted, into Traore's face. There were no tears, no theatrics. Only a man who had known too many men like Sidibe. Only a voice that carried the weight of those who could no longer speak for themselves. Alan shifted. His throat was dry. He reached for the water glass but didn't drink. For the first time since the show began, he wasn't thinking about the next question. He was thinking about a boy he didn't know, in a town he'd never been to, waiting for a father who would never return. And it showed. The once impenetrable confidence in Alan's posture, chin raised, smile thin, began to dissolve. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. His eyes flicked downward. His pen dropped to the table. His fingers tapped nervously. In the audience beyond the cameras, a woman began to cry softly. A man beside her reached out instinctively and held her hand. There were no cheers, no applause, just the stillness of shared grief. Traore looked over at Alan, not with triumph, but with something closer to forgiveness. "We speak of leadership," he said, "but real leadership is remembering who you're carrying and why." Alan opened his mouth but said nothing. He had come prepared for politics. But this was something else. This was truth with a pulse, and it was breaking through. Traore refolded the letter with quiet care, returning it to the inner pocket of his jacket as if he were placing a relic in a sacred vault. The silence in the studio persisted, no longer tense but reverent. Even the background hum of equipment seemed to lower itself in respect. Then, without ceremony or cue, Traore turned slightly toward stage right. "With your permission," he said, "I'd like to invite someone who's lived what we often only debate." Alan blinked, caught off guard. This wasn't planned. There were no names on the guest list beyond Traore. He looked toward the producers behind the glass, but they too looked just as surprised. A camera operator adjusted instinctively as the curtain parted. Out stepped a woman, mid-20s, wearing plain clothes streaked with faint red stains. Not fresh, faded, permanent. Her posture was upright, but there was a tension in her shoulders, the kind born from too many sleepless nights and too many sounds you can't unhear. She wasn't there to impress. She was there because she had survived. "This," Traore said gently, "is Fatima. She's a nurse. She runs a field clinic in Fadengorma. Alone." No one clapped. No one dared to. The weight of the moment pressed down on the entire studio, like the first seconds of a coming storm. Fatima approached the chair Traore had stepped away from, but didn't sit. She stood. "I'm not good with cameras," she began, voice soft but steady. "I'm not good with speeches either, but I know how to stop bleeding with my hands. I know how to keep a child breathing without a ventilator. And last week," her voice caught just once before she continued, "last week, rebels entered our clinic during the night." She looked at Alan now, not with defiance, but with something heavier. "There were 12 patients. 4 were children. I had no guards, no guns, just my body. So I crawled under a steel table and pulled 2 toddlers in with me. I covered them with my own clothes. I whispered to them not to cry." She paused. "I thought we were all going to die." No one moved. Even Alan was frozen. His eyes didn't blink, but they weren't sharp now. They were searching, struggling. Fatima turned toward Traore briefly. "But the army came. They'd gotten our distress call. They were supposed to arrive in 2 hours. They came in 20 minutes. She faced the room again. "If they hadn't, I wouldn't be standing here. And neither would those 2 children. Her hands clasped in front of her were trembling, but her voice didn't break. "I'm not here to tell you politics works. I don't understand much of it. But I understand this. Sometimes the only reason a child is alive is because someone decided not to run from danger, but toward it." The studio had forgotten what it was. It was no longer a stage or a news set or a broadcast. It had become something sacred, an altar of shared pain. Alan swallowed hard. The corner of his eye twitched. The camera zoomed slowly into his face. Gone was the smirk. Gone was the assurance. What remained was a man whose armor had been cracked in real time. Traore stepped beside Fatima again, but said nothing. He didn't need to. For the first time in his career, Alan Diarra, the man who had always spoken last, had no words at all. The silence that followed Fatima's story was not the kind that invited applause or summary. It was the kind that descended like fog, thick, dense, and disorienting. No one in the studio moved. The floor crew stood rooted. The assistant director forgot to cue the next transition. In the control room, Lucy's eyes burned, but she didn't blink. Something unspoken had shifted. Everyone could feel it, even Alan. He sat quietly for longer than anyone expected, his fingers tightening around the pen he was no longer using. His gaze dropped to the notes in front of him, now meaningless lines on a page. Then, with a practiced breath and a forced recalibration of posture, he looked up. The smile was gone. "Mr. President," he said, more careful now but still clipped, "you've spoken of pain, loss, and sacrifice. You've shown letters from the dead, voices from the field, stories that no one can ignore." He paused. "But I have one more question." Traore nodded slightly, eyes steady, hands still folded in his lap. Alan's voice didn't rise. If anything, it softened. But the words it carried were harder than anything he'd said before. "Do you ever feel guilty," he asked, "holding power, while mothers bury their sons?" The words landed like a body hitting the ground. Final, irrevocable, heavy. A ripple passed through the studio like electricity with nowhere to go. An assistant dropped a pen. A producer in the booth mouthed no without realizing. Even Fatima, who had stepped to the side of the stage, turned her head slowly toward Alan, as if questioning whether he had truly said it. And still Traore didn't react. Not with anger, not with denial. He looked down. His thumb ran slowly over the edge of his wedding ring. The breath he took was shallow, just enough to speak, not enough to steady. Then with a voice no louder than a whisper, he answered. Every single night. It wasn't a dramatic pause. It was confession. I feel it when I write their names in my journal, he said. Each one. I feel it when I meet their families, when I walk through the villages they died defending. I feel it when a mother tries to be brave for her surviving children, and I can't look her in the eye long enough without feeling like I failed her. Alan didn't respond. Couldn't. Traore's gaze stayed fixed on a point in the distance, somewhere between the floor and memory. Power, he continued, doesn't protect me from pain. It forces me to carry it, and if I ever stop feeling guilty, I'll know I've lost my soul. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was sacred, the kind of silence that demanded nothing but presence. Alan looked down at his hands. The pen was still clenched in his fingers, but his grip had softened. For a long moment, he just stared at the ink-stained pads of his fingers as if they belonged to someone else. His mind raced, but no words arrived. The man he had tried to corner hadn't flinched. Instead, he had opened himself like a wound. The camera panned slowly across the studio. Viewers at home watched not with judgment, but with something closer to awe. Because in that moment, leadership wasn't dressed in flags or flanked by slogans. It was a man sitting under hot lights, bearing his guilt not as weakness, but as proof of humanity. And it changed everything. Alan looked up again, slower now. His mouth parted slightly, but nothing came out. The questions were gone. The performance had ended. What remained was raw, uneasy, real. And behind the curtain, Adama watched with damp eyes, one hand pressed to his chest, the other clenched at his side. He had spent so long hating the uniform, and now all he saw was his father's face reflected in a man willing to hurt for others. Every night, Traore repeated, softer than before, as if the words were too heavy to carry at full volume. I write their names. I walk their villages. He was no longer looking at Alan. His eyes tracked something far beyond the studio walls, past the cameras, past the nation's capital, into dusty courtyards where children played beside fresh graves, into fields where widows knelt alone at sunset because no one else remembered the songs their husbands once sang. The microphone captured a faint tremor in his breath. The room felt it like a sudden change in air pressure. The meters on the audio board spiked, not with volume, but with the rawness behind each syllable. He inhaled, the way a man does when he's about to read a eulogy he's memorized by heart. Under the dim light of my desk lamp, he said, I start with the date, then the location, then the name, sometimes just a nickname, because that's all the family can bear to say. I write who they left behind, what they loved, and a promise to return to that place. His voice caught. He cleared his throat, but it wasn't enough to steady him. There are nights the ink blurs. That's when I know I've crossed the line between record-keeping and mourning. The camera tightened. The audience saw moisture at the corner of his eye. Not a tear rolling, not theatrics, but the moment before water breaks its surface tension. He let the silence breathe, because forcing composure would have been a lie. I walk their villages, he continued, to see the doors they'll never open again, to greet the neighbors who still set a chair for them at dusk. I stand where they fell and listen. If you stay long enough, the ground will tell you the story, how the crack of a rifle echoed against the mud walls, how the dust rose and settled around the blood, how someone, a wife, a brother, a child, had to decide whether to scream or whisper a final goodbye. The lighting crew exchanged glances, unsure whether to soften the key light on his face. None of them moved. The honesty was luminous enough. Power, Traore said, drawing the word out as if testing its weight, is not a shield. It's a stone you carry in your gut. When mothers cry, you feel it grind against your ribs. When fathers stiffen their lips to look strong for surviving children, that stone grows heavier. His shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the posture of a man who had forgotten he was on camera and remembered he was at a graveside. He turned finally to Alan, who sat motionless, eyes glossed, pen forgotten on the desk. "You asked about guilt," Traore said. "Guilt is the tax on leadership. The question is not whether I pay it, but whether I let it bankrupt my resolve." A hush spread wider than the studio, through living rooms in Ouagadougou, through tea stalls in Koudougou, through Fatima's battered clinic where a dozen wounded listened on a battered radio, through Karim's cracked-screen TV where a boy now sat forward, fingertips white on his knees. Traore's next words were barely above a murmur, yet every microphone caught them. "I made a promise to myself. The day those names become numbers, the day those villages become dots on a map, I will step down, because I will have stopped being useful." He exhaled, a tremor passing through his shoulders. "Until then, I carry them, so the country can keep moving." It struck listeners that he was not using metaphor. He spoke as one who felt bone deep the impossibility of resurrection, yet still bent his back to haul the dead toward the living. Alan's lips parted, but no question formed. What reply could there be to a ledger written in grief? The studio's overhead lights seemed suddenly harsh, as if exposing the triviality of spectacle against the gravity of loss. Viewers across the nation felt something shift from the political to the sacred. This was no longer an interview, but a collective funeral service led by the man most burdened by the procession. Traore looked up, eyes clear now, voice steadier but hollowed by honesty. "Leadership," he finished, "isn't about standing above the morning. It's about kneeling beside it, night after night, until the dawn proves it was worth staying awake." No one spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was reverence, the sound a country makes when it realizes its pain has been recognized in full. Somewhere miles away, a church bell tolled midnight. In the studio, the audience finally exhaled, each breath a fragile vow to remember the names they had never known, because one man had chosen to write them every night. Somewhere in Bobo Dioulasso, Karim wiped his face with the back of his hand, but the tears wouldn't stop. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that came when something too big for a 10-year-old heart finally found its way in. The flickering television before him still buzzed, still faded in and out, but the voice it carried had not wavered. Karim didn't understand every word Traore said, but he understood what he said, because it felt like someone had finally seen him, even from across a screen, even from the Capitol, even through static and distance. His grandmother stirred behind him on the mat, coughing, reaching for water she couldn't afford to waste. Karim turned, gently pushed the cracked cup to her lips, then looked back at the screen. Traore had lowered his head, the letter now tucked back into his jacket. But to Karim, it felt like the president had just handed him something more important than any speech ever had, a piece of his burden. And somehow that made Karim's own feel lighter. At that same moment, behind the velvet curtain of the National Studio, Adama stood frozen. The tray he was supposed to be holding had tilted, and the half-full glass of water had begun to spill slowly down the polished metal. But Adama didn't notice. He wasn't in the studio anymore. He was back at his father's funeral, watching the casket lower into the ground without ceremony, hearing only the thud of dry earth against wood. For years he had buried that sound, folded it tightly behind his hatred for uniforms and headlines. But now in the voice of the man on stage, he had heard that sound again. And this time, it wasn't empty. It carried meaning. It carried mourning. It carried love. Adama wiped his face with the sleeve of his cheap intern shirt. His hands were wet. He didn't care. In the northeast, under the dim bulb of a clinic barely standing, Fatima pressed one hand flat against her chest. Around her, the children were asleep, or pretending to be. The radio still played softly from the tray where she had left it. Traore's final words fading into a quiet that felt less like absence and more like completion. She didn't cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury, but her hands stayed there, firm against her heartbeat, like a vow. She had stitched wounds with bare fingers. Now, for the first time, someone had stitched hers with words. And across the country, the reaction spread, not in chaos, not in noise, but in something far more powerful. In Ouagadougou, a man stepped out of his home holding a candle. His neighbor, watching from his doorway, did the same. One by one, they emerged. Bakers, mothers, school teachers, students. Not shouting, not protesting, just lighting small flames, holding them high. No one had told them to come out. No one had announced a vigil. But across districts, towns, villages, people were doing the same thing, breathing together for the first time in years. They didn't all know the names in Traore's journal, but they recognized the silence behind them. The kind of silence that belongs to a nation grieving, not as strangers, but as a single soul. From the windows of the control room, Lucy stared at the glowing shapes gathering below. People spilling into the street, lining sidewalks, lighting up the night. Her hands trembled on the console. For the first time in her career, she knew the cameras weren't broadcasting a show. They were witnessing a shift. It was no longer a broadcast, it was a heartbeat. And for the first time in a long, long while, the nation was breathing in rhythm. In the control room, a single monitor began blinking faster than usual. Then another. Then all 10, stacked like tiles across the wall, began updating in real time. Lucy didn't notice it at first. Her eyes were still locked on the screen, still locked on the man who had just spoken a sentence that silenced a nation. It wasn't until her assistant gasped, nearly choking on her breath, that Lucy snapped out of it. "Lucy," the assistant said, pointing at the analytics screen, her hand shaking. "You need to see this." Lucy turned. The numbers were moving like they had a life of their own. 187,000, 243,000, 416,000. The live viewer count had been rising steadily since the second block, but now it was leaping in thousands by the second, climbing faster than their systems could accurately graph. The studio had hosted presidential debates before, famous pop stars, even international events. But nothing had ever broken 1 million live views. They were about to double it. Lucy blinked and leaned forward. 842,000, 911,000, 980,000. The system glitched for a moment, then caught up, 1.03 million. And then the calls started. Not just from local networks, not just from the capital, but from across the continent. Line 1, it's RTI from Côte d'Ivoire. Line 3, someone from Mali's Ministry of Communication. Line 5, a French journalist, Channel 24. They want a live feed. Her assistant, headset half fallen from her ear, shouted across the booth, "Ghana just rebroadcasted a clip of the letter. They added subtitles. It's trending." Lucy didn't respond. She was frozen again, not from disbelief, but from something deeper. Awe, maybe, or fear, or both. This wasn't just a broadcast anymore. This wasn't theirs to control. One of the senior producers approached her quietly, voice low and careful. "Should we break for the ad block?" he asked. "We're past the runtime." Lucy's hands hovered over the switchboard. That was the plan, yes. Go to break. Cut the feed. Let sponsors take over. But something in her gut tightened. It was the same feeling she'd had once before, when she was a teenager and got the call that her father's convoy had hit an IED in the north. That same frozen moment when time stretches and something inside you whispers, "Don't move yet. Something sacred is happening." Before she could reply, her private line rang. Not the studio line, the red line. A direct call from a government office, the one reserved for emergencies or executive requests. She stared at it, then picked up the receiver slowly, hands steady even as her heart raced. "This is Lucy," she said, barely above a whisper. A pause, then a voice, calm, authoritative, male. "Do not cut the feed." Lucy blinked. "Sir?" "Let it roll. Let the people hear him. Let the truth speak." The line clicked. She lowered the receiver with both hands and set it gently back in place. No one in the control booth dared speak. Lucy turned back toward the console, eyes wet now, but focused. She reached over and slid the cue for ad break into the unused column. Then she pushed it aside firmly, as if to say, "Not tonight." On screen, Traore sat silently in the studio, the lights catching the edge of his profile. Across from him, Alan was no longer attacking. He was absorbing. He looked smaller now, humbled, as if the stage beneath him had shifted and left him on uncertain ground. Outside the broadcast tower, the street had begun to fill. Candles glowed in rows along the curb, faces lit from beneath like a silent congregation. And still the numbers climbed. 1.2 million. April 1st, July 1st. On social media, clips spread like wildfire. The letter that made a nation cry. He carries our dead and doesn't hide it. A president who whispers what others scream. But Lucy wasn't watching the numbers anymore. She was watching a country wake up. In a room built for ratings, she had stumbled into something far more rare. Reckoning. She sat back slowly in her chair, wiped her cheek with the sleeve of her blazer, and whispered to herself, "This isn't television anymore." And for the first time in her career, Lucy let the silence breathe. She didn't fill it. She honored it. The cameras were still rolling when Traore reached into his jacket once more. This time he drew out a page that looked even smaller than the first. A school notebook sheet, its lines faded and the edges ragged, folded twice, then twice again. He smoothed it carefully on the table between him and Alan, fingers lingering on the creases as though each one marked a heartbeat. He looked at the lens, not at Alan. "This arrived yesterday," he said, voice steady but faint. "A runner carried it 2 days on foot from a village called Gorgaji, near the border. It's from a boy, 12 years old. His name is Yakuba." He glanced at Alan only long enough to confirm the host was listening, then began to read. "Dear Mr. President, I want to be brave like the soldiers. My father died when bandits came. My mother cries at night. I don't want toys this year. I just want to feel safe. Please don't give up on us." Yakuba Traore paused, thumb resting on the boy's signature. The silence that followed was deeper than any before. There was no shuffle of papers, no cough from the audience, not even the whir from the overhead lights. It was the hush of people holding their breath because letting it go would mean conceding that the words were real. Alan had questions stacked in neat bullet points on his card, but his gaze never left the letter. His shoulder muscles, once squared, now sagged as though the gravity of the page itself pressed him into his seat. He did not interrupt. He did not clear his throat. He simply listened. Traore folded the letter back along its worn creases. "Yakuba's village," he said, "has no school with walls anymore. Class is held beneath a neem tree because the roof was shelled last spring. 2 weeks ago, his mother sent him to fetch water. He found a landmine instead. The only reason he's alive to write this letter is that the mine was old. The charge failed to detonate." He exhaled slowly. A child should not need luck to stay alive. Alan's pen rolled across the desk, its idle movement louder than any sentence he could have spoken. He reached for it, hesitated, then let it fall. Traore's voice grew softer. "I have read thousands of letters since taking office. Most ask for food, medicine, a road. But this one," he tapped the page lightly, "asks only for the right to sleep without fear." His eyes glistened, but he did not wipe them. That is the smallest request any citizen could make of a government, and somehow it is the hardest to fulfill. In Gorgaji itself, a battered radio perched on a clay ledge transmitted the president's words through bursts of static. Yakuba sat cross-legged beside his mother, both leaning so close their foreheads almost touched the speaker. When the boy heard his name pronounced clearly by the man in the capital, he covered his mouth in disbelief. His mother pressed her palms together, not in prayer exactly, but in fragile gratitude that someone somewhere had heard them. Back in the studio, Traore addressed the camera. "Yakuba, if you can hear me, I am not giving up. Your fear is my failure, but it will not be permanent." He straightened the page and tucked it back into his jacket. "I keep this letter with me as a reminder that policy without protection is just poetry." Alan's eyes lifted at that line. Poetry. He opened his mouth, searching for a follow-up, but nothing coherent formed. He closed it, swallowed, and nodded, an unconscious gesture of respect rather than agreement. Traore ended with a whisper meant for the entire nation. "Bravery is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to stand between fear and those who cannot stand for themselves. The sentence lingered in the air like the final chord of a hymn, vibrating in every microphone, every speaker, every living room. And so the country listened, candles still burning in the streets, as a single child's plea became a mirror. In it, they did not see politics or armies or debates. They saw themselves fragile, hopeful, desperate to feel safe. And in that reflection, something unspoken yet powerful knit them tighter than any flag could. A collective vow to honor Yakuba's simple wish until the night no longer echoed with gunshots. For 48 hours, Alan Diarra vanished. No statement, no post, no appearance on the evening recap. The man whose voice had once cut through prime time like a scalpel was now silent. Inside his apartment in the upper quarter of Ouagadougou, the curtains remained drawn. His phone buzzed constantly, calls from colleagues, producers, even a minister or two. But he let them ring until they gave up. Empty coffee cups crowded the edge of the desk. The television played the same loop again and again. The interview, or more precisely, his unraveling. He had downloaded the entire footage, raw, unedited, onto a private drive, and for nearly 2 days he watched it on a small screen, over and over, each time more unbearable than the last. The first time, he watched with arms crossed, telling himself he had done his job. The second time, he noticed his smirks, how sharp his voice had been, how he had cut into Traore with the precision of a man who thought every answer must be extracted, not offered. By the fifth time, he paused the screen at the moment Traore sat down on the studio floor. That still image, this young leader in worn military fatigues, resting cross-legged beneath the lights like a student before the nation, burned into Alan's mind like a wound that wouldn't close. And there he saw it, the stark, undeniable contrast between his own posture, rigid, skeptical, armored in ego, and the man on screen who had laid down every defense and still spoken with strength. Alan leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by something he hadn't felt in years: shame. He remembered why he had become a journalist in the first place. Not to trap men in sound bites, but to hold power accountable, to give the voiceless a voice, to ask hard questions, yes, but with purpose, not pride. When had he traded truth for spectacle? When had he begun treating grief like ratings bait? His reflection in the dark screen after the footage ended showed a different man. Not the one the country had come to know. Not the man with perfect diction and tailored suits. Just Alan, tired, hollowed, and finally, humble. He stood slowly, walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Below, 2 children were chasing each other barefoot, their laughter rising into the dusk like birdsong. One carried a stick like a sword. The other held a plastic bottle as a shield. They had nothing. And yet, they smiled. Alan watched them with aching eyes. That was how he used to be, hopeful, dreaming of using his voice to protect the innocent, not corner the wounded. He remembered his mother telling him once, "If your questions don't build, they will destroy." And for the first time in years, he truly heard her. He turned away from the window. It was time. Not for a tweet, not for damage control, but for something bigger. And this time, he wouldn't need a script. The studio was quieter than it had ever been, but the air was heavier, charged with something unscripted. No graphics, no music, no countdown, just a single red light blinking on above camera 1. Alan Diarra stepped into the frame. No tailored suit this time, no expensive tie, no crisp lapel pin gleaming under the lights. He wore a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled, collar open. His hands trembled slightly at his sides as he crossed the studio floor. The same floor where, 2 nights ago, he had tried to dismantle a man who carried a nation's grief. He stood at center stage, alone, facing the camera. And then, without waiting for cue or cue cards, he spoke. "I failed all of you," he said. The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. No preamble, no defense, just that simple, bare truth. I failed the people who tuned in expecting honesty. I failed the mothers who've buried sons, the soldiers who've died without names, The children who can't sleep at night? I failed not because I asked tough questions, but because I asked them for the wrong reasons. He glanced down once, as if searching for a script, but found none. There was only the echo of his own voice and the memory of the man who had answered him not with anger, but with dignity. I tried to provoke a man who wasn't performing, but remembering, and instead of listening, I tried to win. He looked up again, eyes wet now but unwavering. I've spent my life mastering how to speak, but this week I learned how to hear, and what I heard broke me, but maybe that's what I needed. In homes across the country, people lean closer to their screens, not for entertainment this time, but for something they never expected to see on live television. Remorse that felt real. Alan stepped back gently and whispered one last sentence, meant not for ratings, but for healing. From this day on, my voice will serve truth, not ego. He paused. And I thank the man who reminded me what that looks like. The feed faded to black, not with a logo, not with applause, but with silence. And in that silence, a country listened harder than ever. The stage lights had just dimmed. Alan stood alone beneath their lingering heat, the hum of the studio falling into a hush that felt almost sacred. No applause, no music. Just the weight of a nation's gaze slowly lifting, as if giving him space to breathe again. He turned away from the camera, exhaling shakily, not expecting anything more. Then the door opened. Soft at first, just the creak of hinges. Heads turned, no announcement, no entourage, no protocol. Ibrahim Traore walked in, still in uniform, still without guards, his boots silent against the studio floor. The moment stretched, unscripted, unreal. Alan's breath caught. He froze in place, unsure whether to bow his head, extend a hand, or simply fall apart. But Traore didn't wait for a reaction. He walked straight up to him, paused for only a second, and then did something no one expected. He placed his hand gently on Alan's shoulder. Not as a reprimand, not even as forgiveness, but as a gesture that held something deeper. Understanding. Alan looked up, eyes brimming, lips parting to speak. But Traore shook his head lightly, the smallest smile playing at the corner of his mouth. And then, softly, so softly the microphones barely caught it, he said, "This is how nations heal." No speech, no cameras zooming in. Just that. A moment between two men, once adversaries, now human. And in that simple touch, in that quiet declaration, something vast and invisible began to mend. Not just reputations or careers, but a country's belief in grace. There were no sirens, no armored cars, no press vans trailing behind. Just two men walking, side by side, through the narrow alleyways of Ouagadougou. One wore the same simple military uniform, the other a plain shirt and weary eyes. Ibrahim Traore and Alan Diarra walked not as president and journalist, but as two citizens rediscovering their country. Children peeked out from doorways, vendors paused mid-sale. Some bowed, others extended hands. Traore stopped often, never in a hurry, kneeling to tie a boy's shoelace, helping a woman carry water, smiling gently at each soul who met his eyes. There were no reporters, no grand speeches, just moments. A toddler ran into his arms. An elder clasped his hand, eyes glassy with unspoken gratitude. Alan said little, still stunned by the humility surrounding him, and with every step it became clearer. This wasn't a photo op. This was who Traore had always been, before cameras, before titles. In a quiet village on the city's edge, a group of boys played with sticks, their laughter rising through the dust. One noticed Traore and froze. Slowly he approached, eyes wide, and asked the simplest question of all. "Are you the man on TV?" Traore knelt to meet his gaze, smiled, and replied, "Yes. But more importantly, I'm your servant." The boy tilted his head. "You serve people?" Traore nodded. "Every real leader does." The group circled around him, curious and unafraid. He sat in the dirt with them, listened to their stories, about missing fathers, hungry nights, dreams of flying planes or owning books. He didn't promise them miracles. He just listened. For a child to be heard by a leader, it was enough. It was everything. And for Alan, standing just behind them, it was the moment he finally understood the weight of the title president when carried with love. Back in the Northeast, in the quiet of a war-worn clinic, Fatima stood before a small photo taped to the wall. Captain Sidibe in uniform, smiling with his son. She knelt and lit a candle beneath it, shielding the flame from wind with her hands. She whispered, "We remember you." In Gorgaji, the radio crackled. Yakuba and his mother leaned close, hearing Traore's name again. This time not in politics, but in poetry. Yakuba smiled, the kind that came from deep inside. He didn't know if things would change, but for the first time, he felt seen. He hugged his mother tightly, and across the country, people remembered not the questions Alan had asked, but the answers Traore had given. They didn't quote debates. They quoted dignity. They didn't remember outrage. They remembered quiet strength. And long after the cameras stopped, the line that echoed across fields, schools, hospitals, and homes wasn't shouted. It was whispered with reverence. He wasn't acting. He was remembering. This story isn't just about a soldier or a journalist. It's about what happens when ego meets humility, when performance collapses in front of authenticity. Ibrahim Traore didn't fight back with anger. He didn't defend his title. Instead, he led with pain, memory, and quiet strength. That's why his words pierced deeper than any debate ever could. In a world obsessed with noise, here was a man who led through silence, not weakness, but the kind of stillness that carries the names of the fallen, the cries of the forgotten, and the dreams of children like Yakuba. What stayed with me wasn't the confrontation, it was the transformation of Alan, of the audience, of a nation. Real leadership, it seems, isn't about power, it's about service. It's about listening when the world expects you to speak and standing up only to kneel beside those who suffer. And maybe the most powerful line wasn't scripted at all. He wasn't acting, he was remembering. Now I wonder, have you ever met someone whose quiet truth changed how you saw the world? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.